to hunt gators in the Louisiana Bayou. Grandpa and my 4 great aunts and uncles grew up hand-to-mouth in a little town called Rosedale, near the Atchafalaya River and the bayous it flowed into. Times were tough even before the Great Depression, but after Wall Street crashed, money became even harder to come by. You could try your hand at shrimping or fishing, but since most folks couldn't afford luxuries anymore, the seafood market took a huge hit. Store-cupboard staples like canned fish or oysters still moved, but the canneries only needed so many workers. And the same could be said for the logging crews, too. Construction jobs dropped off almost entirely once the Depression hit, and so did the demand for wood, which left good, honest folks like my grandpa with fewer and fewer options. There was good money to be made selling moonshine, but with Prohibition in effect till '33, it was still a risky business around the time Grandpa needed work. If the revenue men didn't get you, your rival moonshiners surely would, 'cause there was no sure thing as a friendly competition when it came to selling moonshine. However, if you were desperate or crazy enough, there was another method of making money back then, one that would make you an awful lot too while putting food on the table at the very same time: alligator hunting. The bayou outside of Rosedale is a tangle of cypress trees and tupelo gums, with narrow waterways running between small strips of land that folks call hammocks or house islands. There are much more open stretches of water here and there, but the gators thrive in those mosquito-infested mazes that are sometimes so dense that barely any sunlight reaches the mud and murky waters below it. And there, and if they get enough food, gators can grow from 3-foot juveniles to 12-foot monsters in just over 5 to 6 years. Then the bigger and more powerful they get, the more dangerous and deadly they become. Gator trappers had to know the terrain inside and out if they wanted to safely navigate in and out of the swamps, and a lot of folks made money that way, guiding hunters or trappers into the deepest parts of the bayou where all the oldest and biggest gators lived. You had to know where they nested, where they basked, and where they'd relocate to whenever the rains or tides came in. But if you got it right, you can make a hell of a lot of money in those days. An experienced party of hunters and trappers working dawn till dusk might bring back 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 gators. Then, with good quality gator hides selling for $3 or $4 apiece, a party of 5 could each expect to take home money and food to last their families a week, and all from just a single day's work. It wasn't just the hides that were in demand either. If you salted the gator meat, you could make it last even longer, or sell it while keeping the fresh stuff for yourself. Grandpa also said that there was a mambo, a voodoo priestess out near Mayette Point, who'd pay good money for the gator's teeth and claws for use in her black magic rituals. Given how lucrative it was, it's easy to see why gator hunting attracted so many amateurs, especially once the economy really went into freefall. But it was also very dangerous work, obviously. In that first year or so after the crash, dozens of enterprising but inexperienced young men waded off into the deepest, darkest depths of the bayou, hoping to secure a living, but finding nothing but death. Arguably, the safest way to bag yourself a gator back then was to trap one. A trapper would bait a heavy hook of iron or steel with a hunk of meat, the more rancid the better, and then simply hang it over a tree branch with a rope like they were fishing. Grandpa said that it could be a horribly effective method, but only when it worked. The gators were just as likely to lunge out of the water than tear the meat from the hook without getting impaled, and like the steel-holed leg traps that some trappers used, not everyone could afford them. Instead, most of the greener boys simply waded out into the swamps with a rifle or a shotgun and hoped for the best, but few ever returned. The same could be said for the whole crews of boys who paddled out in their pirogues in the middle of the night. They used to bring oil lanterns along with them, and when they raised them up high, they'd be able to see the telltale glow of an alligator's eyes. It must have made for an easy method of finding them, but with all that splashing around and with all that blood in the water, it was often the case that the hunter became the hunted. Stray into the wrong waters and an angry gator could snap a boat in half, or drag a man under the water and drown him before his friends even realized what was happening. Just getting bitten out there could prove fatal too, like in the case of one hunter who ended up being the lone survivor of his party. Gators tore up his boat and ate his friends, and although he managed to escape, the trapper had to wade through stinking swamp water all night long in order to make it back to his hometown. Now, folks over there were heartbroken that they'd lost loved ones, but took solace in the lone survivor having made it home. But he didn't last a week. All that nasty swamp water had soaked into the bite wound to his leg, and he quickly came down with some kind of infection. His family called in a doctor all the way from Baton Rouge, but in the days before antibiotics, there was nothing he could do. And that blight took him down in just a couple of days, and when he was buried, they lowered 3 empty coffins into the dirt right next to him, one for each of his missing friends. Now, news of any deaths out in the swamps always swept through the parish like wildfire, but not one of them stopped people heading out there to hunt gators. And it got so bad that people started making money returning the personal effects of the missing, should they happen across washed-up pirogues or abandoned camps. It was about then that the parish sheriff decided to call time on the whole situation, so he and his boys started cracking down on anyone hunting or trapping without a license. But since licenses cost $5 and could take weeks to obtain, the crackdown didn't stem the steady trickle of the desperate and the doomed. My grandpa was lucky enough to have a license, as did a handful of other Rosedale residents, and although there was sometimes fierce competition between parties, their rivals were for the most part friendly. They'd all meet up to drink, smoke, and swap stories at a place they called the Blind Tiger. And that wasn't even the name of the joint either. A lot of illegal drinking spots were named Blind Tigers back then, and all because of some joke about paying a man to see a blind tiger when, really, you were spending your money on booze. Anyway, a lot of the Rosedale trappers and hunters would meet up at this one Blind Tiger on the woods off of Hunter's Run, and they needed no incentive to get drunk and barbecue gator meat, but the real benefits of hanging around that place were the tricks and tips and lessons that you learned from other hunters. Grandpa and his hunting buddies, Charlie and Whit, used to stop by the Blind Tiger every evening, sometimes just to get the scoop on where the good hunting was that week. He said he used to hear some fine and fanciful rumors around that bar. But then, in the summer of 1931, Grandpa heard one which absolutely stole the show. There was a guy, Little John Guidry, this gator hunter who headed up a group of 4, and he was busy telling everyone in attendance about a recent trip into the deepest recesses of the Bayou Sheen. They were out looking for the biggest gators they could find when, suddenly, they saw this huge, alabaster white gator basking on a narrow house island. Their pirogues were all full up with kills for that morning, so they'd have no room for any additional quarry, but even if they had, it would have taken a heck of a lot of wrangling to get that monster into a boat. Guidry said that from teeth to tail, that albino gator had to be at least 20 feet long, meaning the beast had to be carrying around 2,000 pounds of meat and hide on its carcass. But almost as soon as he and his boys laid eyes on it, it slipped into the water and disappeared. All 3 of Guidry's hunting buddies attested to his claim, and while Grandpa might have gotten away with just calling Little John a liar, accusing his whole party would have been downright foolish. But even so, Guidry and his boys could see the disbelief on the faces of those who listened. The doubt of their fellow hunters didn't seem to bother them, though, because Guidry and his boys claimed their doubters would be laughing on the other sides of their faces once they'd hauled that albino beast back home. And because a hide that size, and in such a rare color, they'd be able to afford a whole week of easy living for the sale of it. And so off they went, night after night looking for Old Red Eyes, as they'd taken to calling it at that point. Then one morning, Little John Guidry's wife woke up to find her husband hadn't returned home. It wasn't entirely unusual for hunters to camp out overnight with their kills, especially if the tides changed or the rains came. But when the sun started to set and Little John's party still hadn't emerged from the swamps, people started to worry. Grandpa said Little John's wife barged into the bar that night and demanded to know why the other hunters and trappers weren't out there looking for her husband. The sheriff and his deputies were out there searching for him, but they didn't know the swamps even half as well as the likes of Grandpa and his buddies. Lil John could be out there somewhere, gravely wounded, sheltering in the wreck of his pirogue as hungry gators circled him, and the only people in any position to help him were my grandpa and his fellow hunters. Grandpa told me that the more he thought about them, the more Mrs. Guidry's words made sense. He imagined being stuck out there, bleeding to death while the gators closed in, and how he'd be praying someone from town came looking for him. It wouldn't feel right going back into the swamps without a mind to look for Little John and his boys, even if it was just to bring home what was left of them. And so, one day, Grandpa met with Charlie and Whit at the Blind Tiger and put a proposition to them. They traveled deeper into the swamps than they ever had before to bring home some gator and maybe, just maybe, Little John Guidry along with them. Now, Grandpa and his buddies were faced with two very big challenges here. First off, heading out into the deeper parts of the swamp would require an overnight stay someplace, and it was in darkness that the hunters had the most to fear. Then secondly, they'd need the help of one or two extra hunting parties to cover all the ground they needed covering. Grandpa told Charlie and Whit to go get the supplies that they needed for this long trip into the bayou, while he went around trying to enlist the other hunting parties into joining them on the search. But just about everyone he spoke to thought he was crazy. While it was heartbreaking that Little John Guidry had gone missing, and while everyone felt sorry for his wife and kids, it was his own damn fault for heading too deep into the bayou, and all the while searching for a giant white alligator that may or may not have been something he made up. If a dozen more hunters went out there looking for him, in places that human beings did not belong, the most likely outcome was that more families would just end up wearing black. And just like Icarus, as they say, Little John flew a little too close to the sun and got his ass burned. Nobody's fault but his own. Grandpa said that he couldn't blame people for feeling that way. He even agreed with them to an extent, but there was still that voice in his head telling him he had to do something. He told me that he thought that voice was actually Jesus because he knew damned well how crazy of an idea it was, but he wanted to do it anyway. Yet as luck would have it, so did just one other hunting party. Gaston Dupree, or Gator to his friends, was one of the best hunters and trappers in the entire parish, but it was no secret that he was sweet on Little John's sister-in-law, a girl named Eulalie Badru. Grandpa said that he took some convincing, but in the end he agreed. Then after they'd all gathered up their men and materials, the 7-strong hunting parties set off in their pirogues towards Bayou Sheen. Grandpa said that first day was slow going. They had to keep their eyes peeled for any trace of Little John and his boys, and they had a 14-mile stretch of river to cover before they reached Bayou Sheen. He said it was very eerie out there that morning, the only sound being the putter of their pirogues' small engines as they glided through the water. And I know what he means too, because it all looks exactly the same today as it did back then. The water was black as oil, cypress trees stabbing up through the surface and these wailing birds sounding like wandering spirits. You might spot a half-submerged log, floating just a little too still until you realize it's no log at all, just another gator waiting patiently for its next meal. It can get very creepy out there when it's quiet and still like that, yet there was Grandpa, heading out into the bayou's deepest, darkest depths. The two hunting-turned-search parties arrived at Bayou Sheen in the early afternoon. It was around there that Little John claimed to have seen his prize gator, so both parties figured it was a good place as any to start looking. They agreed to meet back up on the main body of the Atchafalaya River in the morning, but until then, they were to split up and drive the pirogues up and down the narrow channels looking for any sign of Little John, his boys, or the remains of any other poor soul who had disappeared in the previous few months. To safely navigate the much narrower waterways, Grandpa and his buddies, Charlie and Whit, switched from their engine to their oars, paddling up and down Bayou Sheen until their arms ached from it. They saw plenty of gators, swamp rats, and the occasional snapping turtle, but no sign of Little John or his hunting party. They searched all afternoon and well into the evening. Then when the light started getting low, Grandpa and his two friends began looking for a house island dry enough to camp on. They continued up and down the channels, with the bayou getting darker and darker with each passing minute, until finally they were forced to navigate by the light of nothing but their oil lanterns and the moon. Grandpa said that sort of navigation was very dangerous, mostly because the chances of wrecking your pirogue were much higher. And if you wrecked your pirogue way out in the deep swamps, you were in major trouble, even if you were a strong swimmer. And with that in mind, they paddled very slowly with Charlie at the head of the boat, lantern in hand, guiding them through the darkness. He couldn't hold it too far over the front, though, not unless he wanted his arm bitten off by a gator, and they knew that they were surrounded by them because they could see all of those eyes reflecting the orange glow of their lanterns. Grandpa always said that was the worst part of paddling through the swamps at night, seeing everything that was looking back at you. And although I've never seen the sight myself, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. After a while of searching for a place to camp, Grandpa said that he and his buddies started seeing lamplights in the distance. They figured that they might have happened across the camp of Gator Dupree and his boys, but as they got close, they realized someone had built some kind of structure way out there in the swamps. They paddled closer and closer, unsure of what to expect, and then suddenly, Grandpa said he spotted a big black cross painted against a white background. It was a church, its rear on a house island, its front right up against the water, and it was deathly quiet. Grandpa and his boys pulled up to the landing, calling out to see if anyone was home, and a few seconds later, some old half-blind deacon emerged to welcome them. When they mentioned that they were looking for a place to stay, this deacon said that they were more than welcome to spend a few hours sleeping among the pews. Grandpa and his buddies thanked him, tied up their pirogue, and then piled into the tiny church to find a total of 4 pews lit by candlelight and an old rugged cross to the front. When the deacon asked them what they were doing out in the swamp so late at night, Grandpa shared the tale of Little John in their hopes of bringing him home alive. The deacon said he'd pray for the man's safe return, but when Grandpa mentioned the great white alligator Little John claimed to have seen, the deacon's expression, he says, turned cold. He told Grandpa he'd seen Old Red Eyes himself, up close too, and not only was it real, but it was the biggest damn gator he'd ever laid eyes on. He said he'd been out in his pirogue, sharing the good word with some of the swamp folk who lived out near Catahoula, and then while on his way back, he was paddling on a stretch of water when something huge and pale slipped out of the undergrowth to his rear and into the swamp. He said it was no use a thing that size trying to hide, and the almighty splash that it made as it slid into the water had him clutching at the crucifix that hung around his neck, and he started paddling like a madman, trying to get away from it, but every time he looked over his shoulder, the bubbles on the surface got closer and closer and closer. He knew the bayou well enough to know that a gator had taken a deadly disliking to him, and if it snapped his pirogue in half, he was going to have to swim like the devil to safely reach solid ground. But then, right as the thing was about to reach him, he started up with, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and he leadeth me beside still waters." The deacon said it seemed like the moment the words "still waters" left his lips, the bubbles stopped moving. He kept on paddling like his life depended on it, but the great white gator submerged beneath those waters, the one that had once seemed intent on making him dinner, had stopped dead in its tracks. Grandpa said his buddy, Whit Watson, told the deacon that, with all due respect, it was going to take more than prayers to bring in an animal of that size. And once again, the deacon turned white. Grandpa said the deacon lowered his voice and then told him to listen, and listen good. He then said that, sure, they were living and breathing. The devil moved among the bayou, and that he'd seen him with his own eyes, and that he moved through the beasts and the birds just the same as he did through people. He didn't know where Old Red Eyes was, nor did he know exactly what he was, but he had more chance of dragging us all down to hell than we did dragging him out of that swamp. His words didn't come off at all that kind, but the deacon meant them as a good-natured warning. An alligator that size and temperament wouldn't be brought down easy, and Grandpa was putting his life at risk just moving through its territory. But they hadn't paddled all that way just to turn around and head home, not when they were so close to the heart of the swamps. So, at dawn, once there was enough light to get going again, Grandpa and his buddies climbed back into their boat and then set off deeper into the bayou. Grandpa said it was still early in the morning and they were paddling slow while eating stale bread and molasses for breakfast when they suddenly heard a distant sound that chilled their blood. 1 minute, there was nothing but the low buzzing of bullfrogs, cicadas, and crickets coming from the underbrush, and then out of nowhere, there was the distant boom of a gunshot. It was just one at first, the kind of single large-caliber gunshot you hear when a trapped gator gets dispatched with a rifle. But then they heard 4 or 5 more pops way off in the distance, these smaller guns going off, only these sounded way more frantic, like something wasn't going to plan. Grandpa said he and his buddies started paddling like crazy in the direction of the gunshots, but soon they started to see some really big gators floating in the waters around their boat. Unlike the smaller juveniles and young adults in the outer swamps, these fully grown gators didn't much feel like moving out of the way. So rather than risk making them mad by bumping them with their boat, Grandpa and his buddies started taking things much slower, while having to pick their jaws up from the bottom of the boat at the sheer size of some of these things. He said there were some real monsters out there, the kind they'd usually have stopped and hunted before retreating out of danger. But on that occasion, they just kept paddling by, trying not to bother them, as they continued into the heart of the bayou. Grandpa said that they carried on paddling for about an hour, getting more and more nervous as they did, because if they strayed into any of the gators' spawning grounds, some overprotective mamas could cause them some real hassle. They're taking things real slow, keeping their eyes peeled and their mouths shut. Then at one point, they paddled around a wall of bald cypress trees and spotted something that almost turned their stomachs. Through a jagged clearing on the bank, they could see a campsite strewn with the blood-splattered remnants of Gator Dupree's hunting party. Grandpa said it was one of the most horrific sights that he'd ever seen. Guns and gear were scattered everywhere, and empty John boats still listed in the shadows, while half-eaten bodies lay among the sawgrass as flies buzzed over the carnage. There were limbs missing. Bodies had been ripped open with one man's boot sitting upright still laced like it had been yanked clean off, and it was the kind of mess no knife or gunshots leave behind. But if it was a gator that had made that mess, it must have been unusually big and very fast for an animal its size. Grandpa said that after seeing all those bodies, he and his boys started to discuss turning back, because if he, Charlie, and Whit went any deeper into the swamps, it might be their half-eaten bodies some horrified group of hunters would end up happening across in the future. Gator Dupree and his boys were much more experienced hunters than they were, and had traveled in larger numbers too. If they hadn't been able to best whatever had attacked them, what chance did Grandpa and his buddies have? Grandpa said that on the journey back, the weight of all that loss hung over them. They felt ashamed and defeated, but if they didn't return home, then who would provide for their families? Whit was up front paddling steadily when he suddenly pointed out a huge gator, easily 12 foot long, that was basking on a house island. Whit said that he thought it was the gator that killed Dupree and his crew. Charlie was skeptical and said just about any gator that size or bigger could have done it. Grandpa said he was about halfway through agreeing with Charlie when the murky waters in front of the 12-foot alligator suddenly exploded. Out of nowhere, the monstrous 20-foot albino gator surged up from the depths of the swamp. Pale as death, its reddish-pink eyes flashed as its jaw clamped down on the basking gator's head with this disgusting crunch. The smaller gator thrashed wildly, whipping its tail and flailing its stunted limbs, but it was no match for this humongous beast that had somehow managed to take it completely by surprise. The albino gator then dragged it back into the swamp in a swirl of foam and blood, then swam off submerged before it was all still again. Whit's jaw was dropped as Charlie froze with the paddle mid-stroke. Grandpa said he was the same, still as a statue in the rocking boat, just staring at the ripples that thing left in its wake. Grandpa said there were a few moments of stunned silence, the boat rocking gently as the ripples slowly faded. But then suddenly, the water down the channel started to churn, and the next thing they knew, a huge blur of silt and pale hide was slicing through the swamp, coming at them so fast they barely had time to react. Grandpa paddled like the devil, while Whit fumbled with a shotgun, slamming shells into the breach, and he said he turned just as the beast erupted from the murky water, streaming off of its ghostly hide, teeth bared for the kill. As old Red Eyes surged upward, jaws gaping like an open grave, Whit fired twice. The blast echoed across the swamp as shotgun pellets tore into the albino's snout. Fresh, bright red blood streaked its scales, but the shots were only enough to daze it, and it sank beneath the surface with a hiss. Grandpa said the boat suddenly lurched forward as the beast splashed down, and for a moment he thought that they might be in the clear. But maybe a second or two later he heard the same thrashing sound in the water behind them as old Red Eyes once again prepared to charge. Grandpa said his arms were burning by the time the water exploded again, but still he and Charlie rowed like the devil, willing each other to push harder, while at the rear of the boat, Whit held the shotgun with trembling hands and began praying out loud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he yelled as he reloaded. "He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for he..." Grandpa said Whit's final words were drowned out by another explosion of water. That albino beast lunged, jaws snapping inches from the boat's edge, but Whit's timing was right, and his aim was true. Grandpa said he heard a deafening roar as Whit unleashed another 2 shots, only this time, the pellets ripped through old Red Eye's flesh, causing dark red blood to gush into the foam. The beast thrashed, a guttural bellow escaping its maw, and then it slumped, wounded and broken, before slinking off back into the depths. Whit rushed to reload the shotgun as Grandpa and Charlie kept paddling, but except for the creak of the boat, the splashing of the oars and their ragged breaths, the bayou soon fell silent again. The boat glided through the swamp, their paddle strokes slow and heavy as they reached the next bayou, which would take them home again. Grandpa said he remembered how Whit sat up front, shotgun still across his lap, with a look of exhaustion and guilt across his face. He said that expression captured the mood. No bodies recovered, no closure to carry home, and they'd been lucky to escape with their lives. That sense of defeat made the journey back feel endless. They spoke little, their silence louder than words, dreading the shame of returning empty-handed to families who hoped for miracles. And the sun was setting by the time they reached the dock near where Rama stands today, and Grandpa and his buddies climbed out, legs very unsteady, and then they left their boat tied up as they walked on into town. First came the reunion, with parents, siblings, and kin of all kinds rushing forward. Whit's ma threw her arms around him, not caring that her boy smelled like sweat and swamp rot, while Charlie's baby sister clung to his leg and his pa praising Jesus for a safe return. And Grandpa remembered all of this, as well as his mother telling him how proud she was. It didn't matter that they'd return empty-handed. They tried, and that's what counted. Second came the bad news, delivered personally to the families of Gator Dupree and his boys. Gator's mama collapsed with a wail when Grandpa broke the news that her boy wasn't coming home, and that she would have taken a nasty tumble if she wasn't caught by Gator's 2 sisters. The same went for the families of his hunting party. The kin had gone out to rescue Little John and save his kinfolk from the agony of his loss. But in a horrible twist of fate, they too were now condemned to wear black. To Grandpa, it all seemed like some kind of sick cosmic joke, and he couldn't help but feel like he was the punchline. Why shouldn't he survive when so many hadn't? And how could he live with himself knowing that he'd turn tail and run at the first sign of trouble? He said he struggled with thoughts like that for a long time, until the day of Little John's funeral when his grieving widow told Grandpa how much she appreciated his efforts to recover her husband's body. Grandpa said that helped him deal with most of the guilt he felt, but not all of it, and he ended his gator hunting days for good after the encounter with old Red Eyes. He traded the bayou for a cornfield, ended up catching the eye of that Boudreaux girl that I mentioned earlier. Then, after a long courtship, they were married under the cypress trees during the spring of 41. And sadly, the draft snatched him up in 42, and after storming through the liberation of France and helping free villages from Normandy to the Rhine, he returned to his beloved home and started a family. And years later, Grandpa would sit us by the fire in a low voice and tell us this exact story of his encounter with old Red Eyes. But whenever he did, he'd swear to us kids that no battle ever chilled his blood like the day he and his boys stared into the crimson glare of the monstrous albino alligator who almost dragged them all to hell. In January of 1999, two brothers from South Florida, James and David Adams, ventured into the Big Cypress Swamp for what they expected to be a routine hunting trip. The Big Cypress, a sprawling wilderness of cypress strands, sawgrass marshes, and pine flatwoods, was familiar territory for the pair. So armed with rifles and riding an ATV, they drove out deep into the swamps to hunt deer and small game. But what began as a simple day trip spiraled into a 6-day nightmare that tested the limits of both their endurance and their sanity. Things started to go wrong when their ATV broke down deep in the swamp, miles from any dirt road or highway. To their horror, the usually reliable vehicle's engine suddenly sputtered out, leaving them stranded amid a labyrinth network of muddy waterways and dense vegetation. Back in the late 90s, cell phone reception in such remote areas was spotty at best, meaning it was impossible for the brothers to summon assistance. So instead of waiting around and hoping someone stumbled across them by chance, the Adams brothers decided to abandon the ATV and trek back on foot. They later said they assumed they could navigate using the sun, as well as their hard-worn instincts as seasoned outdoorsmen. But the swamp had other plans. In the days prior, heavy rains had swollen the swamp's waterways. Rising water levels erased familiar landmarks and turned even the driest patches of ground into quagmires of knee-deep sludge. The brothers tried their best to maintain both course and composure, but each soon realized that they were hopelessly lost. As dusk fell, the temperature plummeted, and in a rare cold snap for the usually balmy South Florida, that night's temperatures dipped into the 40s. Wearing only light hunting gear, James and David had no jackets or blankets to keep themselves warm, and instead huddled together under a cypress tree, shivering as the damp air seemed to seep into their bones. When darkness arrived, the swamp came alive with unsettling sounds. The brothers heard the guttural bellows of alligators, the rustle of skittering swamp rats, and the constant drip of the ever-rising water. James later recalled hearing a loud splash nearby. Convinced it was a gator sizing them up, he grabbed his rifle and tried to remain calm. But every snap of a twig sent spasms of fear through the brothers' guts as their minds raced with thoughts of what lurked in the dark. On the second day, hunger and thirst set in. The two brothers quickly ran out of what little food and water they'd brought along and, in desperation, resorted to sipping from pools of stagnant brown swamp water. They gagged at the taste of rotten decay, but knowing dehydration would kill them far quicker than any germ or parasite, they drank it all the same. As they walked, their boots grew heavy with mud and their legs ached from wading through the mire. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, leaving welts on their exposed skin as they tried and failed to swat them away. At one point, David, the younger of the two brothers, started to exhibit signs of severe fatigue. James urged him on, but he too was beginning to falter. They needed a route out of the swamp, and they needed it soon. And on the third day, James and David stumbled across an old hunter's camp. It was little more than a rotting wooden platform half submerged in the water, and there were no supplies to be scavenged. But since it offered a brief respite from the endless sea of mud and slime, the two brothers decided to rest a while. They tried to start a fire with soggy twigs and a lighter James carried with him, but the damp wood refused to catch. They endured, but as darkness fell, so did the rains. That night, a storm rolled in, soaking them to the core and flooding their makeshift shelter. The rising water forced them back into the swamp, where they clung to tree roots to avoid being swept away. James later said that he thought they'd drown right there, swallowed by the swamp, and began doubting if they'd ever get out alive. On day 4, exhaustion and hypothermia began taking a brutal toll. The brothers' pace slowed to a crawl, with each step becoming a battle against both the sucking mud and their own failing bodies. David's lips turned blue, and he began mumbling incoherently as signs of delirium set in. His brother, terrified of losing him in the vastness of the swamp, tied their belts together in order to keep him close. They'd stopped talking about rescue. Survival was now about enduring from one hour to the next. And that night, they heard a helicopter in the distance. It was part of a search effort launched by their family after they failed to return. But to the brothers' horror and frustration, the swamp's canopy was too thick for the chopper to see them, and the sound faded away. Day 5 brought a dim flicker of hope. The brothers found a patch of higher and thus drier ground. Then with trembling hands they managed to spark a small fire using some grass and the last of James's lighter fluid. The smoke was thin, but they took turns feeding the fire, praying that it would be enough to draw the attention of search and rescue teams, because their time was running out. The brothers' bodies were breaking down. James's feet were raw from trench foot, and David was so weak he could barely stand. Both were gaunt, their faces hollowed out by hunger, and as the swamp began to sense their weakness, its wildlife grew bolder. James said at one point he spotted the eyes of what he could only assume was an alligator, reflecting the glow of their firelight. He aimed his rifle, readying himself for the beast to attack, but fortunately it did not approach. On the morning of the 6th day, January 14th of 1999, a rescue helicopter finally spotted the brothers' faint smoke signal. The pilot, part of a coordinated search involving swamp buggies, airboats, and dozens of volunteers, hovered over the clearing as James waved weakly with tears of joy and relief streaming down his face. Ropes were dropped before medics hoisted the brothers aboard. They were skeletal, dehydrated and hypothermic, their core temperatures having dropped dangerously low. Paramedics wrapped them in blankets, using IVs to pump fluids into their veins as they were rushed to a hospital in nearby Naples. It was there that doctors marveled at their tale of survival. 6 days with no food, with only tainted water to drink, not to mention exposure to the elements in a swamp teeming with predators. All in all, it was nothing short of a miracle that the Adams brothers were still alive. James and David recovered physically, though the mental scars lingered. James later told reporters, "I thought we were gator food. Every night I heard them out there, waiting." Their story became a local legend, a testament to human resilience and a stark reminder of the Big Cypress Swamp's unforgiving nature. And for those 6 days, it wasn't just a landscape. It was a living, breathing adversary that almost claimed their lives. Tucked within the low-lying coastal plains of southeastern Virginia, the Great Dismal Swamp is a living labyrinth of towering bald trees emerging from murky, muddy pools. In ancient times, the peat-rich forests that surround the swamp were the favorite hunting grounds of the native Chesapeake and Nansemond tribes, who stalked deer, wild turkey, and feral hogs through black gum trees that turned a bright orange-pink in the fall. While more recently, the swamp served as a refuge for those escaping a life of slavery in the antebellum South. These days, The Great Dismal Swamp has been designated a national wildlife refuge, with contemporary conservation efforts ensuring a boom in the populations of black bears, bobcats, and otters, along with its 70 species of reptiles and amphibians, and its 213 varieties of birds. The swamp is even home to a few alligators, vagrants who swim up the Pasquotank River from the wetlands of North Carolina. But in the late 1980s, it played host to one of the most chilling criminal events of the decade. Thomas Lee Bonney was born and raised in Chesapeake, Virginia, and as a young man he established an auto salvage yard, which he grew into a very successful business. He married a woman named Dorothy May in the late 1960s. Then, in August of 1968, they welcomed the first of 6 children into the world, a girl named Kathy Carol Bonney. Thomas loved his daughter dearly, but Dorothy May soon noticed a certain overprotectiveness in her husband. He was both a religious and reasonable man, meaning his wife felt perfectly comfortable in confronting such behavior. But when she raised the issue, Thomas made a heart-rending confession. Although he didn't go into too much detail, Thomas explained that he'd grown up in the shadow of a deeply abusive father. He was neglected for long periods of time, and whenever his father was around, he'd subject his young son to severe physical abuse for even the most minor of infractions. Thomas told Dorothy May that he loved and despised his father with equal measure, and that he was terrified of making the same terrible mistakes. His wife assured him that together they'd ensure that didn't happen, but Thomas never quite rid himself of his overprotective instincts. Despite Thomas Bonney's overbearing supervision, or perhaps as a result of it, his daughter's teenage years were characterized by a growing spirit of rebelliousness. When he emphasized the importance of her education, she responded by dropping out of high school. Then, after he tried to enforce a so-called no-dating rule, a 19-year-old Kathy began an illicit affair with a married man more than 20 years her senior. Concerned by his daughter's behavior, Thomas searched her bedroom for signs of anything troubling, and in a desk drawer, he found a letter written by her much older paramour. It's believed this letter contained extremely graphic descriptions of illicit acts, and upon reading it, Thomas became incensed. He explained to Kathy that dating such a venally deranged individual wasn't safe, and that extramarital affairs either ended with heartbreak at best or violence at worst. Yet to his horror, his daughter refused to listen. Thomas was faced with every father's worst nightmare. He loved his daughter dearly, but her increasingly reckless behavior was putting her at risk in ways that was impossible for him to explain. Then, in late fall of 1987, Thomas Bonney's deepest and most primal fears became reality. On the morning of November 22nd, Thomas contacted the Chesapeake Police Department to file a missing persons report. He told them that the previous evening he'd driven his daughter to a nearby 7-Eleven to meet a man named John. According to Kathy, John wanted to sell his old Chevy Blazer, which, due to its age and heavy mileage, was being offered at a very reasonable price. Naturally, she wanted to give the SUV a test drive before handing over the cash and had agreed to meet its owner at the 7-Eleven parking lot at around 9 p.m. Thomas agreed to give Kathy a ride, but only if he could observe the meeting to ensure that it wasn't dating-related. His daughter seemed only too happy to let him witness the exchange, so off they went. Thomas then recalled how upon arriving at the 7-Eleven parking lot, he witnessed his daughter's meeting with the Chevy's owner, John. Kathy climbed into the SUV's driver's seat, took it for a spin around the parking lot, then handed over the cash once she was happy with its performance. Thomas said that he congratulated his daughter on the successful purchase of her first car. Then, in her excitement, she asked if she could take it for a spin before meeting him back home. Realizing that stifling one of his daughter's first major milestones would be stupid, the usually overprotective Thomas agreed to the proposal, but not without a warning to be home before midnight. Kathy agreed and climbed into the driver's seat of her brand new Chevy, and then drove off with a toot of her horn. But upon waking up the following morning, Thomas discovered that neither his daughter nor her new car were anywhere to be found. Police told Thomas his fatherly concern was understandable, but in the eyes of the law, Kathy was an adult who was free to do as she pleased. Under the circumstances, a missing persons report could be filed after 24 hours without contact. Thomas tried waiting until the 9 p.m. deadline, but was so gripped with terror over his daughter's well-being that he called back just prior to 7 to express his anxiety. Then, and only then, was an officer dispatched to the Bonney family home. Upon the arrival of law enforcement, Thomas repeated his account of giving Kathy a ride to purchase the SUV. He believed that John, the vehicle's apparent owner, might somehow be involved in his daughter's disappearance. But given her newfound mobility, she could have driven just about anywhere before getting herself into trouble. Thomas also mentioned the extramarital affair Kathy had been conducting and how he believed the man in question was a dangerous deviant. Then, after sharing as much pertinent information as possible, the officer thanked Thomas for his time and then departed his residence. For Kathy's friend and family, the night of November 21st was a sleepless one. While many feared that driving at night on deserted Virginia highways had resulted in some kind of road accident, others suspected Kathy's recklessness had finally bore a terrible fruit. Yet the reality was much more horrifying. The following afternoon, a local hunter named James Sawyer was trudging along a heavily wooded area near the Great Dismal Swamp Canal when he made a deeply alarming discovery. A pair of blood-stained underwear was sitting near the water's edge, and just a few feet away, the naked body of an adult female was lying in a disturbingly unnatural position. Her torso was riddled with gunshot wounds, and she'd been so badly beaten that she could only be identified via fingerprints. Then and only then did police realize that the victim in question was the missing 19-year-old Kathy Bonney. A subsequent search of the teenager's bedroom revealed a half-finished letter to her married paramour, the contents of which had never been made public, along with some adult magazines and a pair of handcuffs. Thomas was devastated. He had long suspected that his daughter's older lover was priming her for deviancy, and the discovery of the handcuffs seemed only to confirm his worst fears. In light of that, his cooperation with detectives was enthusiastic to say the least, with Thomas giving hours upon hours of recorded interviews in the hopes that some minor detail would force a break in the case. Yet the more he talked, the more certain inconsistencies in his story became apparent. The first thing that aroused the detective's suspicion was the casual change of detail in Thomas's story. For weeks, he claimed to have driven his daughter to the test drive in his wrecker. Then one day, he suddenly claimed to have used a Chevrolet. Thomas also told detectives that in the weeks before his daughter's murder, he'd sold his 9-shot .22 revolver for $100. But when police asked the name of the person he'd sold it to, Thomas claimed that he couldn't remember. Detectives then spoke to Thomas's business partner, whom he operated the salvage yard with. In his experience, Thomas was an honest, hardworking, and deeply conscientious person, a man who made doing business with him a pleasure. But over the previous few weeks, he'd started noticing something strange. One day, Tom's partner approached him with a solution to an ongoing problem they'd been experiencing. He explained the situation, then laid out the proposed solution in as simple a manner as possible. Yet to his surprise, Thomas Bonney didn't seem to know what he was talking about. He remained quiet, maintained a confused, almost bewildered look about him, then when his partner asked if he understood, Thomas replied with a nervous-sounding, "Yes, sir." Firstly, Thomas never, ever called his partner sir. The two weren't exactly close friends, but they'd been working together long enough to have developed a casual but trusting relationship. The most formal Thomas ever got was calling his partner by his first name, so where had the sir suddenly come from? Later that day, Thomas's business partner reapproached him regarding his potential solution just to make sure all had been understood. Thomas seemed to have returned to his composed and confident self, but to his partner's confusion, he claimed to have no recollection of the discussion regarding their problem. Assuming Thomas had been preoccupied and had not fully listened, his partner re-explained his proposal. Thomas understood perfectly, gave him the go-ahead, then concluded the discussion amicably. His partner was pleased, yet remained so unsettled regarding Thomas's apparent memory loss that it was one of the first things he mentioned when questioned by police. Detectives soon turned to Kathy's siblings for answers, and in December of '87, they spoke to her younger sister. Susan Bonney claimed that despite his wholesome veneer, her paranoid control freak of a father was feared by all his children, but none more so than she. You see, it was her that had seen bloodstains in her father's Chevy on the same night Kathy was thought to have disappeared. It was her that pretended not to see them, and it was her that prayed her father remained ignorant of her discovery. Not wishing to raise suspicion, detectives found a way of casually asking about the Chevy's whereabouts when Thomas told them he'd sold it in the days following his daughter's disappearance. They rushed to track it down, and in doing so, a terrible truth began to emerge. After seizing Thomas Bonney's Chevy from its new owner, forensic investigators conducted a thorough analysis of the suspect vehicle. They located the bloodstains Susan had referred to, along with long strands of hair in the vehicle's trunk, and then quickly determined both belonged to Kathy. It's not clear how Thomas Bonney got wind of the investigation's sudden shift, but on December 11th of 1987, he fled Chesapeake in the middle of the night. Dorothy May was so alarmed by some of the things her husband said and did as he packed up his car that she reported herself to the police that same day, claiming she couldn't protect herself or her children from a man she no longer recognized. The manhunt lasted 2 months. Then, on January 31st of 1988, Thomas Bonney was arrested in Indiana. Once back in Virginia and having been detained on suspicion of his daughter's disappearance, Thomas was interviewed extensively by psychologist Dr. Paul Dell. Using hypnotherapy, Dr. Dell was able to identify 10 separate personalities contained within Bonney's mind, leading the doctor to conclude that Thomas was one of the most profoundly deranged individuals he'd ever come across. Along with Tom, the so-called host personality, Dell identified personas named Satan, Mammy, Damien, Viking, Tommy, Hitman, Preacher, Dad, and finally, Kathy. These personas had been created by Thomas's psyche, with each serving as a conduit by which he could process the horrific abuses of his childhood, which were apparently far, far worse than anyone had been led to believe. Dr. Dell conducted extensive interviews with many of Thomas's split personalities, including one in which he claimed Kathy was still alive and visited him in his cell every night once the guards turned out the lights. Dr. Dell conducted extensive interviews with many of Thomas's split personalities, including one in which he claimed Kathy was still alive and visited him in his cell every night once the guards turned out the lights. In Dr. Dell's opinion, such prolonged interactions left him in no doubt whatsoever that Thomas was suffering from an acutely severe case of dissociative identity disorder, along with post-traumatic stress disorder and mixed personality disorder. Dr. Dell also claimed Thomas had extensively expanded on his childhood traumas, how his father had subjected him to unthinkable levels of emotional and physical torture, and that his issues surrounding control stemmed from the sudden and unexpected death of his grandmother when he was just 10 years old. However, at Thomas's trial, a prosecution-appointed psychiatrist contested Dell's diagnosis. Dr. Philip Coons had not interviewed Thomas personally, nor did he posit any official diagnoses. But after reviewing a whopping 13 hours of Dell's footage, he realized the doctor had almost completely failed to maintain proper standards of care. Not only was Dr. Dell's line of questioning unbefitting of a psychiatric interview, but he had allowed Bonney to ramble, asked him suggestive and leading questions, and had improperly suggested to Bonney that he might have other personalities while the patient was under hypnosis. What's more, Dr. Coons argued that the death of a family member was insufficient to induce a dissociative identity disorder, then made the shocking claim that Thomas's symptoms might have actually been created by Dr. Dell's hypnosis. Dr. Coons' testimony was somewhat backed up by a physician who interacted with Thomas Bonney during treatment in October of 1988. This physician argued Thomas was indeed displaying symptoms consistent with Dr. Dell's diagnosis, but disagreed with the idea that Thomas had somehow blacked out while murdering Kathy, or was otherwise unaware of the severity of his acts. In summation, the prosecution's argument was as follows. On the night of Kathy's murder, it had in fact been Thomas Bonney's idea to go check out an SUV that was for sale, but the entire story had been nothing but a fabrication. It's clear the pair stopped by the 7-Eleven that Thomas spoke of, as Susan Bonney actually witnessed her father's vehicle pulling out of the lot. However, instead of taking Kathy to view a car, he drove her south towards the North Carolina state line, where a violent argument ensued. Thomas confronted his daughter regarding the extramarital affair that she was conducting. Then, when he was told to mind his own business, he pulled over, dragged her out of the car, then shot her to death at the side of the road. Then, to make it look as if she'd been killed by a lover, Thomas Bonney stripped Kathy of her bloodied clothes, made sure to leave her underwear clearly visible to anyone who might discover her, then beat his own daughter's face to a bloody pulp to give the impression her murder was a crime of passion. Bonney's defense team announced that they agreed with almost half the prosecution's version of events. However, in their opinion, it had been Kathy who, in the heat of the moment, had reached for the firearm she knew her father kept in his glove compartment. The defense then argued that during the ensuing struggle for Thomas's firearm, it accidentally discharged, and this is when the persona known as Demian took hold. To Demian, Kathy was not his child, merely a threat to be eliminated. Demian had been created to protect Thomas Bonney. It was the persona's one and only purpose, and protect him it did. 2 hours after murdering his own daughter, Tom returned home, and possibly owing to the condition diagnosed by Dr. Bell, he was able to look his wife dead in the eyes and ask with all sincerity, "Where's Kathy?" Bonnie's defense team made a compelling argument, but the jury disagreed, and following a 7-week trial, they pronounced him guilty on November 25th of 1988. Bonney appealed his life sentence, but the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld his conviction in June of 1991. On July 29th of 1994, at around 8:30 in the morning, Bonney and a fellow inmate escaped from Central Prison through a trash compacting chute and hid in a garbage truck. While it was initially speculated that both had been crushed to death in a trash compactor during their escape attempt, the two men had stolen a car and driven to Hampton Beach. Thankfully, Bonney was captured by police 4 days later and offered no resistance. He explained the escape had been a spontaneous idea, and that his main motivation had been to visit the grave of his late mother, whose funeral he was unable to attend. He also said he wished to visit the grave of his daughter, Kathy, in order to offer an apology for his ultimate and unforgivable failure, to protect her from himself. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you've got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, speak to the cheeks. When I was 9 years old, I came home from school one day to find my mom and my grandpa sitting at the kitchen table. They'd been waiting to give me some bad news, and that bad news was that my dad was missing. He and my Uncle Lee had gone off on a weekend hunting trip and were about half a mile into the woods east of Coretta when Dad realized that he'd left his grunter in his truck. And a grunter is basically just sort of a duck whistle, but it sounds like a buck's grunt, and after telling Uncle Lee to wait where he was, Dad walked back to his truck, never to be seen again. Uncle Lee said that he waited about 20 to 30 minutes before he started to get worried, and then he made his way back to the truck. But my dad was nowhere to be found, and by nightfall, Uncle Lee had every deputy from the McDowell County Sheriff's up in those hills trying to find my dad, and the search effort lasted about 2 weeks, but after failing to find a single trace of him, the county sheriff called it off. Mom kept his name on the missing persons register for a long time, while the whole family and all of his friends pitched in to hire a private investigator. The guy was a retired police officer from Charleston, a good one too, but in the end, there was only one thing that he could tell my mom and grandpa that they hadn't already heard from the county sheriff. The most likely explanation was that, for some reason, Dad had walked through the woods until he came to a series of old mining pits near a town called Cucumber. And then, as their theory goes, Dad walked into one of those mines, fell down a shaft, and his body had been laying in the bottom ever since. Yet during that initial search and rescue attempt, every mine shaft that could be safely explored had been mapped out by a team of caving specialists, and the tunnels that weren't safe had teams of cadaver dog handlers dispatched to them. Dad's body wasn't found in any of them, though. That didn't mean that it wasn't there. The sheriff couldn't rule that out entirely, but there was something that he neglected to mention that Mom later found from the PI that she hired. There was graffiti in one of the mine shafts. The private investigator said he didn't recognize any of the symbols or words, but they'd been crudely daubed in a sort of spray paint about midway through one of the tunnels, so he could only assume that the place was a hangout for local teens. And that's what led him to believe that the kids who'd tagged those tunnels might also know what happened to my dad. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't locate any of them. Uncle Lee tried to help as best he could and kept in close contact with the private investigator, but he took Dad's disappearance harder than anyone. Everyone kept telling him that it wasn't his fault, that there was no way that he could have known, and that he did all the right things. But he was never quite the same after Dad disappeared, and no one could blame him. I didn't get the full story of what had happened until I was much older, but between the day he went missing and the day Mom had him declared legally deceased, there was a lot of hope and a lot of heartbreak. Having my sister and I asking when is Daddy coming home almost drove Mom crazy with grief. But as we got older and we accepted that he was never coming back, it got more and more easy to deal with until it just kind of faded into the background. Dad's disappearance was behind us, but it was still there. It was always there, really. By the time I was 22, my sister had moved over to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a fixin' shop in Welsh, and I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years by that point. He sent us birthday and holiday messages and would occasionally call Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance, but other than that, he kept himself very distant. At least until the day when Mom said that he'd called and had asked to talk to me. I was more than happy to see him for the first time in years, and I understood why Uncle Lee had kept his distance. He once told my mom that I reminded him of a younger version of my dad, and while some of those memories brought him a lot of joy, they brought him a lot of pain too. And because of that, I thought I wouldn't see much of Uncle Lee anymore, and that brought me quite a bit of pain as well. And so you can imagine how happy I was when I'd heard that he wanted to meet up. I drove over to his place out near Filbert one Saturday around midday, and what followed was what I can only describe as a 2-person family reunion. We were both happy to see each other, and after spending all morning worrying that he'd be some depressive alcoholic, it was a huge relief to see him very clear-eyed and on his feet. As we caught up, we shared some cold cuts and chow, along with a cold beer, and the conversation sort of meandered around the subject of my dad until there was no avoiding him anymore. We talked about this and that, things he used to do and how much we missed him, and then out of nowhere, Uncle Lee had a proposal for me. He asked if I wanted to visit the site of my dad's disappearance, suggesting that it might provide a degree of closure. He said that he'd been up in those hills east of Coretta about half a dozen times, and even though he'd never found so much as a trace of my dad, it helped alleviate the feeling of uselessness that had plagued him ever since. And at first it didn't sound like such a hot idea. I could appreciate why walking those hills helped Uncle Lee deal with the pain and loss, but to me, meandering around the area my dad vanished from sounded like slow torture. I was just happy to be in touch with my uncle again, someone I could actually build a relationship with, because after my grandpa died, he was the only paternal figure I had left. Focusing on my dad like that, in a negative way I mean, I couldn't see the benefit. Yet slowly but surely, over the course of about a year or so, I came around to the idea that this might provide some much-needed closure. I'd been visiting Uncle Lee every couple of weeks between the time we first got in touch and the day that I suggested that we drive up into the hills east of Coretta, and then hike out to the place that he last saw my dad. He was happy to hear that I'd changed my mind, but it was very muted, for lack of a better word. Kind of like he didn't want to show the emotion of how much it meant to him, because he was worried that it'd scare me off. He didn't ask what had changed my mind, but if he did, I'd have told him that it came down to something as simple as this. If I started feeling too emotional, negatively emotional I mean, we could always just turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive home. Nothing was keeping me there, and if walking those woods didn't provide any good feeling, at least I'd be able to say that I tried. Uncle Lee and I arranged to drive down to Coretta together on a Saturday morning in early May. To my relief, we'd somewhat shifted the focus away from my dad's disappearance and began treating it like a regular old hike through the woods. We'd uphold our long-standing tradition and take along a few beers and some cold cuts, and then if at any point I felt like talking about him or asking questions about my father, then we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I'll admit to feeling a little anxious as we drove alongside the creek and got closer to the back road we were good to park my truck on. But by the time we got to walking and talking, I realized that patch of woods was no different than any other in West Virginia. I'd always considered that area around Coretta to be haunted. Not literally, of course, but it might as well have been like the ghost of my dad was wandering those hills. I never wanted to go there as long as I lived, so to suddenly be there one day and realizing it was mostly all in my head, it was definitely good for me. But the word mostly is kind of carrying a lot of the weight in that sentence. And as much as it felt regular as anything to be walking through those woods with my Uncle Lee, it was like there was still a piece of my dad out there, hiding away someplace. Call it a memory, call it hope, but there was something, and I could feel it. And we kept on walking and talking till we got to Big Creek, and then after making ourselves comfortable on a flat rock at the edge of the creek, we had ourselves a little break. And I figured that marked the halfway point of our hike, so when we were done, I suggested that we head back towards my truck. But Uncle Lee had another idea. He said that there was something he wanted to show me. And then after another mile or so of walking, we came to a rocky outcropping which overlooked the abandoned mines that I told you about earlier. I asked him if that was the place the private investigator had checked out all those years before, and Uncle Lee said it was. And then after a sigh, he said that there was something he'd never told me and my mom. He told the sheriff all right, and he told the PI too. He just never had the heart to tell me or Mom that the last time he'd seen my dad had been when he was walking in to one of those mine shafts. So between noticing my dad was missing and informing the authorities, Uncle Lee said that he'd run all over the woods calling out Dad's name and trying to find him before the situation got serious. Uncle Lee said that he was never much of a tracker. He simply got lucky in heading in the right direction. He didn't think my dad had walked in the direction of those mines, but when he stood in that exact same spot that we were stood in, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like my dad walking into one of the dark, derelict tunnels. Uncle Lee said that he scrambled down the steep incline of the outcrop and then ran off in the direction of the mine shaft that he'd seen my dad walk into. But when he got there and walked inside with his flashlight in hand, there was no one there. When I asked Uncle Lee if he'd seen the same weird graffiti as the PI did, he said no. but that there was something about that old mine shaft that made him feel very uneasy. According to Uncle Lee, that's what had truly been haunting him for all these years. The idea that he'd seen his brother walk into a dark tunnel, then upon hearing his name being called had chosen to hide in the dark, pretending not to hear. And to him, that was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something had happened to him in that old mine, something terrible that meant that he couldn't walk or talk anymore, even if he wanted to. I understood why such information had been withheld from me. The situation was bad enough, without piling more unsettling mystery on top of it, but still, I told Uncle Lee that I was glad that he'd shared the whole truth with me, even if it was as disturbing as it was painful. And I figured after that it was time to leave, but Uncle Lee had another proposal for me, and one that I found impossible to turn down. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him, as it was something he himself did every so often as part of his attempt to exercise that area of the hills. And by that point, I couldn't think of a reason why we shouldn't. We'd already walked all that way, and I had no idea if or when I'd return. And so not heading down to that mine seemed like it'd be a wasted opportunity, and if it worked for Lee in dispelling some of the heartache, then it might just work for me too. And so I agreed, and off we went. Heading down the steep face of the outcrop was definitely not a smart move, so we walked around the edge of the mining pit a little bit to find a safer way down. At the bottom, all kinds of warning signs had been hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out, and that they'd be seriously injured if they tried exploring any of the old tunnels. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought that my dad had fallen down a mine shaft or had been the victim of a freak cave-in that had left him unable to respond to his cries. He didn't know for certain, but if that was the case, Dad's body would have been found a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it happened in that old mine. It just hadn't been properly explained yet. As we got closer and closer to the mine's entrance, which appeared as a jagged scar in the rock, it was like the air itself grew heavier. Very little light was making its way down the tunnel, but I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth in the mouth of some great serpent. Neither myself nor Uncle Lee said a word as we approached the entrance, and the place was so quiet that the sound of our boots crunching into the gravel and slate seemed unnaturally loud. I started to see things like discarded tools, a cracked lantern, a coil of frayed rope half buried in the dirt, things which suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry rather than in an organized or phased fashion. I asked Uncle Lee if he knew why the place had been abandoned in the first place, and he said that he'd heard rumors of flooding, but didn't know for certain if they were true or not. The official explanation was that the company had simply gone out of business. But if that was true, why did the place look like it had been abandoned so hastily? And as we got within just a few feet of the mine's entrance, it was like the temperature dropped by a few degrees, and the darkness in front of me seemed to swallow up all the outside light after just a few feet. I figured Uncle Lee could sense my apprehension, because he started telling me how I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. All I had to do was say the word and we could just leave. But like I said, there was no way I was going to just turn around and go home, not after we'd walked all that way. And so, slowly but surely, I started walking toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I can recall the oddest things from the first few moments. I remember how it got even colder as I stepped into the shaft, and how the air had both a smell and taste to it too. Just dust, metal, and mold all rolled into one. The light from outside disappeared quickly, but luckily, I had a tiny flashlight that I kept attached to my keyring, and so after sort of fumbling with it to free it from the ring, I held down the small button and suddenly I could see again. I say I could see again, but not by much. The light from the little keyring attachment was only enough to keep a few feet of darkness at bay, so my pace stayed slow as I tread deeper into the tunnel. I took a few steps and then stopped, then, after taking a few more, I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following me. But when I did, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Uncle Lee was standing near the cage gate, almost like a total silhouette by then, but there was just enough light for me to see that he held something in his hand. It was something that I knew that he had with him, but something he had no reason to produce in that moment. It was a gun, and the hand that he held it in was shaking. In the microseconds that followed me spotting the gun in his hand, part of me screamed out to reason with him, and there was a brief glimmer of hope when the thought occurred to me that he produced that pistol for our own safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he didn't say a single goddamn thing as I turned back to look at him, I got this feeling, sharp as a blade, that I wasn't safe at all. And so I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my tiny, crappy flashlight as the first of Lee's gunshots rang out. The crack split the air behind me, and the bang felt like it exploded my eardrums as I felt the bullet fly past me, all in the same moment, and my adrenaline surged as I realized, to not make myself an easy target, I had to turn my flashlight off. Then as I eased my thumb off that button, I was just plunged into darkness. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I didn't know it was even possible to feel that level of terror. The only light came from Uncle Lee's shots as my lungs burned and my muscles began to scream, and any second I expected to either take a bullet or slam into a complete wall. As it turned out, I was headed for a wall, and the only thing that alerted me was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel diverting into 3 different directions, and I picked a path in a split second and then kept running. And only then I was out of Lee's sight that I could switch that little flashlight back on and start looking for a place to hide. As I ran into the diverting tunnel, the weak glow of the flashlight in my hand started to bounce off the much narrower walls, and I suddenly realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the private investigator had mentioned, but even while running at full speed, I saw it was unlike any variety I'd ever seen before. It looked like writing of some kind, smeared in black paint, and an entire section of the tunnel appeared covered in what had to be more than 1,000 lines of it. I didn't even recognize the language, but for reasons you're already aware of, I also didn't have time to stop and study it. What I was really looking for was a place to hide, and I soon found one. Soon after I started to see all that weird script on the walls, I started to see a bunch of smaller and larger chambers leading off from the tunnel that I was running down. I picked one at random, lunged into it, and then tucked into the nearest corner to conceal myself from Lee's flashlight in case he pointed it into the chamber. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart was hammering against my ribcage, and I quickly realized my hiding place did nothing to dampen my terror. Sure, I was out of Lee's sight, at least temporarily, but more than anything, I realized I was trapped. I remembered how I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but for the first few minutes, which felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the tunnel having amplified that sound of Lee's shots. I wondered if my hearing would ever go back to normal, and imagined Lee being able to creep right up on me without me ever being able to hear him. It was almost a relief when I started to hear his voice, along with the sound of crunching gravel as his footsteps got closer and closer. I wasn't deaf, but I was still trapped, so what little relief I felt was quickly drowned out by the raw terror of knowing that I was being hunted. Lee started calling out my name, telling me to come out, not trying to reason with me or make excuses for shooting at me, just telling me that I needed to come out because sooner or later, he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have almost certainly alerted him to my location, so I had no other choice but to remain in place and stay quiet as possible. That part was surprisingly easy because running all that way, with how unfit I was at the time, meant that I was more than happy to stay still and just catch my breath. When his footsteps got louder still, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel my hiding place was at. Staying still and quiet suddenly got a lot harder in that moment. I remember saying it over and over in my head, with my voice being clear as a bell in my mind saying, "Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please, God, don't let him find me." And I guess God listened, because instead of heading down the tunnel that I was in, he just kept on walking. I thought that might be my chance to make a run for it. If Lee was heading deeper into the mine, then maybe I could slip out behind him. But that glimmer of hope was quickly snuffed out when I remembered how loud my own footsteps would be, and how he might not miss all of his shots that time. And he technically had not missed all of his shots. I later found a bullet hole running through one of the flap pockets of my jacket. But like I was saying, I stayed dead still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for Lee's voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsating into my ears, but it wasn't as bad as it had been previously, and I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued to hunt me down. His footsteps were slow and steady, and occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't quite make out. But then suddenly, his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick with a scrape of gravel, and then there was silence. It sounded like he suddenly turned around, like he'd heard something that had startled him, and he figured it was me trying to make a break for it. He stayed still for a few moments, a horrible silence hanging in the air, and then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." And hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible, because Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. It was like my mind was on the verge of fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee must have lost his goddamned mind. There was no other explanation for it, and the reality of what that meant for me was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to a sense of kinship. We'd already lost one man in the family. There was no reason to lose another, especially not by his own hand. But I also knew that there was a chance that that gamble would be the last I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me, and there was nothing to say that he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to just staying put, and simply waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him, and try to get control of that gun. Then whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder and louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I couldn't tell you who it was. They didn't say a word, and I didn't hear any additional footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting someplace deeper in the tunnels, and then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and then started to mutter something under his breath. I had absolutely zero clue what was going on. I was scared out of my mind, but all I could do was stand there, still as a goddamn statue, and keep my ears tuned like my life depended on it. Because it did. And Lee just carried on muttering to himself, or at least it sounded like he was muttering to himself. And then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep down someplace, and it smelled like evil. And when I say that it smelled like evil, I only use that word in place of death. I was about to write it smelled like death, but as someone unfortunate enough to have come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer, that's not the same scent as what I smelled in that mine shaft that day. It wasn't that sort of sick smell of rotten decay that makes you want to either puke or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can truly sum it up. Like something that can't exist here on the surface, something older than the mine itself. It had me covering my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first assumption was that it was one of those toxic gases I once read about miners having to worry about, and I remember thinking, so this is why they had to abandon this godforsaken place, as I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose. And then suddenly, I hear Lee begin to yell something. I can't guarantee that these were his exact words, merely by recollection of them, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot, said stuff in between like please or you gotta believe me. But he said that first part over and over, in fits and rage, with his screams getting louder and louder until I couldn't make the words out anymore. By the time his yells had degenerated into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, in the hopes that he was suitably distracted. He wasn't anywhere near the tunnel I was in. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but during the whole time that I was hurtling out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling, I heard Lee's screams. I kept on hearing them as I ran out into the daylight too. They were much fainter and had this eerie, echoey quality about them, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. And I didn't look back though. I didn't even consider it. I just kept on running towards the gentler slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I then scaled it and then carried on running through the woods until my legs screamed out no more. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept on echoing around in my head, and I was overtaken by these contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because, for whatever reason, Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I began walking back to my truck, and it took a long time before I spotted the glint of its metal bed through a thinning thicket of trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, and then after yanking it open, I slid into the driver's seat and just sort of sat there for a moment, staring at the windshield. I couldn't even process what had just happened to me, and I think I've already said this, I couldn't feel happy that I made it either. Instead, it was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the county sheriff, along with a single word: why? I could only manage to drive my truck as far as Coretta before I had to stop. There was no way that I'd be able to drive safely given my condition, and it was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked a motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell that she was a little scared of me on account of my appearance and demeanor, but she let me use their phone all the same. I didn't bother trying to keep the call private. I mean, I lowered my voice, but with a girl right there in front of me, there wasn't much that I could do to keep her from hearing. I told the dispatch lady that my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber, and how I thought that he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. And I must have sounded real wigged out and distant, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up to the motel in a cruiser maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, and I told them everything. They wrote it all down, then they told me that they'd call me once they checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything that had happened, but there was no processing it, and even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. And what followed was the exact same process as what happened after my dad went missing. At least, I imagine it all went down in a similar way. The sheriff got search and rescue involved, who once again explored the mine as deep as it was safe to do so, and there was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings lying near the entrance from where he'd shot at me and I'd run. I told them all about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started to scream, "He's here, I brought him, I did what you asked." And then after many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the county sheriff announced their conclusion, and this is what he told us. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These events involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in the mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure, and cause poison gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. And it's one of those blowouts that the sheriff believed me and my uncle had been caught up in. They explained that in all likelihood, Uncle Lee was hit with a kind of gas cocktail, consisting for the most part of highly concentrated CO2, and this led to a kind of frightened disorientation which ended up causing him to attack me in his confusion. Naturally, given the circumstances, the sheriff told me and Mom that Lee had become the #1 suspect in my dad's disappearance, in which there had almost certainly been some kind of foul play involved. There had been no activity in his bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the #1 reason we all thought that he was gone and hadn't just decided to vanish without a trace. I mean, it was still possible that Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later, but the sheriff himself said that he was very interested in catching up with Lee so he could find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. But more than 2 decades have passed now, and not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his search and rescue people searched the mine, he ordered them all to seal it off with explosives to prevent others suffering the same tragic fate. But their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. And what I'm writing now is the first word of objection I've ever committed to paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second that it was some rush of CO2 that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened as I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad, saying all that weird stuff and eventually screaming unintelligibly. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by the fear, the adrenaline, probably a dose of CO2 myself, that I didn't really know what had happened to me. But I do know what happened to me, and I know what happened to my Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I also don't think that I'll ever be ready to really say it, because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know that there's something out there, deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber, that's better off left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. Or, in plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken a lot of interesting projects in my time, and while most have been both enriching and satisfying, there's one that I frankly wish that I could forget. And that's not down to the subject matter nor the people that I dealt with, as I cannot speak too highly of either, but rather a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and sociocultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians. To cut a very, very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remains hotly debated, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi Native Americans. Genetic studies, such as those from the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws had been established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances are known to vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons have assimilated into broader populations, But these days, it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges what has traditionally been rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity, and in anthropology it's rare to get one like that doesn't come with a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. And I was overjoyed to receive the news my proposal had been accepted. But if I'd have known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell that I'd ever have honored it. And this is why. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over the gravel as I wondered if the old girl was finally going to give up before I made it to my destination. The latest thread that I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which one you studied, wasn't even on the map. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that ostensibly deviated from normative physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured that there was no harm in chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside, smoke curled from chimneys, while a few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe the air that smelled of damp earth and pine oil. A man in overalls nodded me from across the street, and I quietly nodded back, then headed inside the store. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me up with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist, tracking Melungeon bloodlines, and he frowned, giving me another look of mistrust and then pointed me toward a direct path leading up the ridge. "Folks up there don't take to outsiders," he said, and then told me, "You better mind yourself." I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, and then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed up steep and cut through thick woods as my boots crunched on leaves and twigs, and it was tough going, but after maybe a mile or so I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, and her eyes were dark and steady as I introduced myself, and I said that I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. "She the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the porch, and the door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair, who looked as if though they might be brothers. They didn't invite me in, and they didn't ask me what I wanted either. They just stared until I took the initiative and explained why I was there. I kept it simple, and then the slightly shorter man who had a scar across his cheek told me, "Mama's 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other one nodded, and then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke, with a dim living room lit by a single electric lamp. In the corner, lying in a single bed, was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say that she was skeletal, I mean that in the very sense of the word. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood, and while her eyes were sunk so far deep in their sockets that it made her look nothing short of ghostly. Her hair hung in these thin white strands, and her hands rested like claws by her sides, and her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else, and as I sat down on a stool one of her sons dragged over for me, she exhibited no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, "Onada," from behind me. I then asked where her people came from, and she offered no answer, and her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood, but still got nothing, and her sons hovered nearby, their arms crossed as they watched. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her now." I told them that I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest, and a 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades, I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft as I asked her, "Ma'am, how long have you lived for? And how have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word, and after her eyes widened and her lips parted, she turned to me with a look of fear on her face. And then, in a faint, raspy voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." And the strain of forcing out the words looked like it was killing her, and when she was done, her eyes rolled back and her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over, one yelling for me to get out while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. Then as I walked back down to the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed around my skull. What in the world did she mean by, "It eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted that more than anything to just demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned as I started down the path with the son's cry of "don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter and heavier, and as I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over in my head. Oneida's face wouldn't leave me, and neither would her words. And I tried to sleep, but the whole encounter just kept replaying in my mind. Then, when I finally did get some sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare where it was me who was lying in that bed, more than a century old, crunching the words, "It eats the years," in the face of some terrified young researcher. And the next morning, I called a research fellow that I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Oneida and what she'd said to me. And he went quiet for a few seconds, then, after audibly clearing his throat, said that he'd heard a lot of rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details, just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me and that he was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend had hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. And so about a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and then walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Oneida's home had been, no one was on the porches and the houses seemed empty. I reached Oneida's family home and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. However, upon finding that door was unlocked, my curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Oneida. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out, but I got nothing but silence. And it was like everyone vanished. And weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the questions still gnawed at me. What had Oneida meant by "it eats the years"? It obviously couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor, but for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge, but I had no luck. I then engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson's Special Collections Library, and it was there that I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while elbow deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s that detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge to a T, and while he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant that he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you'd assumed my encounter with Oneida and her 2 sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard, but with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided that the best course of action was to simply try and forget about it. But I can't forget, and no matter how hard I try and rationalize what Oneida said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say that I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. But on that day, and in Oneida's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. Among the shadowy hollers of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless, that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was a woman who actually existed, and over time her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the true account of a presence so vile it defied explanation, and a nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804 and have since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the untamed beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch or perhaps a restless animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a dour demeanor, was the first to glimpse their vile visitor in the flesh. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with a fiendish and unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket, but as the shot echoed across the field, the canine creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before, as if the beast had followed John Sr. home. The children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. while Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched itself atop the family barn, before staring at him with eyes that burned like fire and brimstone. And over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bell's family cabin into a crucible of terror. Furniture shook violently, while bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force, and the sightings of strange animals continued unabated. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest circles of hell. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly, things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. However, what was clear was that the spirit spoke with clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets, and taunting them with hints of horror yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target, as the witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight that it drew blood, with her screams swallowed by the night as the witch's ethereal voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched, helpless, as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, and her voice was reduced to a mere whimper as the witch continued to deny her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted up their insides, causing unimaginable pain, while hurling objects and shrieking curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him, and she pursued her goal with a sadistic and satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue was swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony, while his limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel and malevolent mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep with a vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate Batts, as well as the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family's farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as the wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably and the air filled with a deafening, hair-raising shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have against it? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure, but not without promising to return after 7 years. And true to its word, it reappears in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later. and although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night, and the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still undulates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, foolhardy visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw, its jagged walls glistening with slime and damp, while the air remains thick with a cloying and deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside, armed with skepticism and flashlights. Yet staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar, a sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was a vocal, loud, high-pitched scream, and we looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Of course, logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable, common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real. But was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? And many theories abound. Some call it Kate Batt's vengeful spirit, others a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon, masquerading as some kind of spirit, is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might well account for John's symptoms, while mass hysteria seems to amplify and explain the rest. Yet such scientific theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's wrathful presence. And surely no such hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close-knit community. Today, the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains a pilgrimage site for thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, every unexplained shadow, carries the echo of old Kate Batt's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. The Bell Witch is no campfire tale to be shrugged off at dawn. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a reminder that some evils don't fade, they simply wait for its next victim. And in the stillness of the Tennessee night, when the wind dies and the darkness presses close, you might hear it. A faint knock, scratch, or whisper, which promises that the tale of the Bell Witch is far from over. Hey friends, thanks for listening, and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, she ebben on my kneeser till I Scrooge. Before we get into today's video, I wanted to thank Desolate Entertainment for sponsoring this video. Desolate Entertainment is a new horror channel here on YouTube that specializes in short horror films and series. such as their newest miniseries, Forget Me Not. In this heart-pounding series, you'll follow a man's slow descent into madness after a grisly crime haunts his every waking thought, with a finale you won't want to miss. If you want to watch the full series, you can find the link in the description. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I've never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still don't know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home still is just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles' walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, and then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spend many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ringing, fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened, wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyway, so whatever. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to be a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger, a bloomin' dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, the body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, so had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while it was walking that way. I suppose. I really didn't know. And nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, and then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the leaves was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bollocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked, then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaked from the rain. My senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung the body up after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just completely let out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raised despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a freaking horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed-walking thing again because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. And that's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here, I was yelling. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it over the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. We went directly to the police station and I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said he could hear the bell and thought he wouldn't be able to see me. Asked what if I didn't have my phone? What if he hadn't picked up? They were almost as terrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run and they could hear the danger. They just couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area and the only thing they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that at the time. And my bag was not recovered. They said it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing was my fault. There was just so many what-ifs. I want to believe it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt or something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable and they felt angry that I came into their territory, but what if it was more insidious? The way he moved towards me was abnormal. It was perverse because of how slowly he was ringing the bell. It was like he had me trapped. I didn't see any more details, I just ran. To this day, I can't bloody go anywhere where I'll be alone, and the sound of bells are a real problem, as well as the smell of moss. I never thought that I'd have anything to post on this subreddit, but here I go. This literally just happened, so I'll try to keep this as short and as organized as possible. I'm a 29-year-old female and my partner is a 23-year-old female. We are back in her hometown visiting her family for about a week. It's a very small, isolated town in the middle of nowhere and basically in the middle of the woods. While we were here, she wanted to meet up with an old high school friend who still lives in the area. We'll call him Kyle. So we meet Kyle at the beach, and right away he's acting super weird, making jokes about a three-way with us and just making a bunch of just unwelcome, gross comments. Obviously, we're unfortunately used to this stuff to a certain extent, but coming from someone who was supposed to be her good friend, it was extra annoying. So my girlfriend and I are shooting each other panicked looks the whole time. Once he's out of earshot for a second, she says that she's sorry, that he's never been like this before and we can make an excuse to leave. When he comes back, we tell him we want to get dinner at a local bar, but he just asked to join us. We felt awkward, so we end up saying yes. He says he doesn't know quite how to get there, so he follows us. We get there, order drinks and food, then head out to their patio with the drinks. He makes a few more gross comments, but is generally being way more cool and normal than he was at the beach. We're smoking some weed on the patio and chilling. The food comes quick, and we finish it quicker. Now, here's where it gets really messed up. So halfway through my first drink, I'm feeling really tired, which makes sense as we've had a long day. I give my girlfriend the signal that I want to go. She makes an excuse that we need to go. He keeps trying to get us to come to his house. I've got some good weed and dabs there, and you can meet my cats. Blah, blah, blah. He's being really pushy. We keep saying no and making excuses. We need to check on our grandpa, etc. So finally we get in the car and say goodnight. We park next to each other and walk up and into the cars together while saying our goodbyes. When we get into the car, my girlfriend informs me that she wants to stay at the bar, but fake it like we're leaving because she doesn't want to chill with him anymore, understandably. So we're sitting in the car waiting for him to leave first when he signals for us to roll down the window. We do, he says, GPS is being kind of funny. And can we lead him to the main road? To be fair, we're in the middle of nowhere, so this didn't seem too outlandish. So obviously staying behind at the bar was out of the question. So, in the car, we were talking about how pushy he was being, and she admitted she feels weird driving right back to her grandpa's house, so we should drive into town until we lose him. He's behind us for a long time, even way after he should have gotten off on his exit. We think it's weird, but we weren't sure what to do. So finally we get on a 2-lane road and he pulls up next to us and he's waving a phone, which is clearly my girlfriend's phone, in the window. We pull over. He gives her the phone back, chats just a few seconds, then leaves in a hurry. Here's the part that makes my skin crawl. We know we had her phone. I saw her put it in her fanny pack, which was on the table, along with my phone and her bud, a few minutes before we left the bar as we were preparing to leave. She didn't take it back out. There's literally no way she could have left it at the bar. More importantly, he got in his car and left the bar at the same time as us, meaning he had to have already had the phone when we were leaving. It's not like we left the bar first and he saw it left on the table or something. He literally had to have been walking to the cars with us and calmly said goodnight with the phone already in his possession. Now the kicker, apparently unbeknownst to me, my girlfriend had tasted a very weird bitter taste in her straw at the bar and was already suspicious, especially with how he's been acting. This is why she wanted to stay back at the bar, to get away from him and stay in public where she felt it was safer. So when he walked up to the car to return her cell phone, She very casually and deliberately flashed the knife that she kept for protection in her jacket. I didn't know at the time that she had done this, so that's why he had left so quickly. Obviously, I was annoyed with her for not telling me her suspicions sooner, but she just didn't want me to panic. I'm really shaken up. A few things are clear. One, he stole my girlfriend's phone, and it seems like he did so that we would be forced to pull over on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. Two, he quickly ended the conversation and left when my girlfriend flashed her knife. They've been good friends for almost 10 years. If he wasn't planning on doing something malicious, I feel like he would have acted confused about the knife or said something like, "What's up? Why would you flash a knife at me? Is this some sort of bad movie or something?" But instead he just booked it, which tells me he knew exactly what she was doing, reacting to a threat and preparing to protect herself and me. And three, he probably spiked our drinks. My girlfriend noticed a weird taste in her straw right away and chose not to finish her drink. I finished half my drink and I felt relatively tired. A few more things, I just don't know how he managed to nab the phone without us noticing or knowing. It doesn't really make any sense, but he did. Me and my girlfriend both remember her putting it in her fanny pack perfectly. We also had no idea how he could have spiked our drinks unless he was working with the bartender, but we were the ones who suggested that bar. I don't know exactly how he did it, but I think I know why. And for that reason, my girlfriend's now ex-friend who made creepy comments probably tried to drug us and stole her phone in order to get us alone on a dark road. Please, keep your distance. I grew up in Texas. I still live here along with my family that will be mentioned in the story. When the 2007 recession hit, my father lost his job. It was a management job that paid well. We lived in a comfortable but slightly country area outside of Lockhart, Texas. With our income at a halt, we lost our home and had to move. My parents found a trailer park with a 2-bedroom for rent, a little cramped for our family of 5, but we had no other choice. The man we rented from was crooked for other reasons, but he's not the disturbed landlord this story revolves around. We lived in that trailer for a few years before needing to move out for reasons I was too young to remember. I was 11 years old and my parents began house hunting again. Down the road from the trailer park was a cul-de-sac of land. There was a business in the center of this land called the Why Not Party House. That was a bar or wannabe club, I suppose. Considering I was a child, I never entered the building. There were a few houses and trailers scattered around different parts in this secluded circle. A worn-looking trailer was for rent. The man renting it, Mr. Dahl, was an elderly man who couldn't have been younger than 65 or so. A few things to note about this trailer. It had old stone steps leading up to the front door. There was a bunk bed in one of the bedrooms and a somewhat functioning air hockey table. The master bedroom had a queen-size bed, and there was a carpet in the kitchen, which I always found strange. The back door was nailed shut and completely unusable. If that wasn't enough to make you say nope, then let me also say it had a mouse problem. My family is working class, my mother is disabled, and my father out of work. We only relied on her disability check. We had no choice but to rent out his trailer or be homeless. The entire deal was strange and honestly sad this was the position we were in, but my parents rented out this trailer on the agreement of words only. There was no official lease that was signed or any sort of legal document that proved we were renting from this man. Before we moved into the trailer, Mr. Dahl took it upon himself to build a new deck for us to replace the old steps. He even built a little picnic table for us to sit outside. As a child, it completely blew my mind the stranger could be so kind to craft these things without being asked or wanting money. It seemed like an act of pure kindness. A bad person wouldn't do that sort of thing, right? The first few weeks of renting from him went by without a hitch. The master bedroom had no light bulbs, and we weren't there long enough to change them. So my family and I all slept in the living room. Something about the bedroom with the bunk bed seemed scary to me. I'm unsure how my brothers felt, but they never slept in there either. As I mentioned previously, we relied on my mother's disability check. Sometimes we were late on rent and had to pay late fees. Other than that, Mr. Dahl would be very understanding about everything despite being a little irritated. My mother's check hit every first of the month, which is also the month for bills. Here, my father and my older brother got into the car and drove into the city to take care of bills and get a money order for rent. I was left with my older brother. It was a time when we had no internet or cable, just VHS movies. I was in the hallway. Come to find out, the trailer was flipped and the front door was the one nailed shut, playing my Wii, Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess to be exact. Something I need you all to note. We had no keys to this trailer. The only person with a set of keys was Mr. Dahl, so we were unable to ever lock the trailer when we left. As I was playing my game, right in front of the door that was locked, I saw the knob turn. No knocking. The knob jiggled, and our landlord tried to pry the door open twice, but was unable to do so successfully. I just froze and realized it was him, and he must have assumed no one was home because the car was gone, but the door was locked, and I thought it was fine to continue playing my game. 11-year-old brain, I suppose. My brother was in the living room. We both heard this noise. At first I thought it was a dog barking, and my brother heard it too, but the longer we listened, we realized it wasn't an animal, but the sound of people yelling. My brother went to the front door to investigate the noises, and me being a scared child, I followed right behind him. Both of my parents were standing out in the yard. My mother was shouting at our landlord, who was sitting on a farming vehicle. Not sure what the name of it was. I remember it had a very long piece attached to it. She was visibly angry, and her voice was laced with rage. My father was yelling at him too, but I don't remember anything that was said exactly. My oldest brother asked what had happened, and here's how it goes. My parents pulled up to our trailer with the money order for rent. When they did, they caught Mr. Dahl backing up the farming vehicle against the door, the only exit in that trailer. My mother went into full protection mode, knowing her 2 children were stuck inside. She confronted him immediately. Luckily, he backed away from the door, but he was still operating this farm vehicle. I believe she threatened him. They had an exchange of words, and he whipped the vehicle around fast and aggressively close to my mother, and he almost hit her with it. My parents were bewildered about what they just witnessed. They didn't know what to do, so they called the police. When the police showed up and my parents explained the situation, it was no use because we had no legal agreement of renting out the trailer. The officers shrugged it off and said that there was nothing they could do about anything because no one was injured. Apparently, trapping 2 children inside a trailer that's a fire hazard isn't illegal. We only spent one last night in that trailer. We no longer felt safe there. We packed up as many things in our car as we could, but unfortunately didn't have the money to rent a moving truck for the rest of our furniture. We stored the belongings we took with us at my grandparents' house, and we rented a motel room. It was about a week later after this happened when we tried to go back for the rest of our belongings. We wanted no confrontation with Mr. Dahl, so we showed up to the trailer at night. It was dark inside and the porch light was off. My father and oldest brother went inside the trailer casually. Me, my mother, and my older brother were waiting out in the car. It was no less than 5 minutes when my father and oldest brother ran out of the trailer with speed I've never seen before. They hopped in the car and pulled out of there like some scene in an action movie while my mom was terrified and demanding answers. Apparently, they went into the master bedroom first, which was an immediate right when you walked inside. They were going to grab a box of paperwork we had to leave behind when we left. They noticed something lying in the bed. Not just lying there asleep, but completely naked. It was Mr. Dahl, and right beside him was a gun. We never went back to that trailer. We never recovered the rest of our furniture that had sentimental value. It's been almost a decade since this happened. My mother and I discuss it every now and then, but we're thankful that time is behind us. I can't help but wonder if all that abandoned furniture was the result of some other unfortunate family who had to leave everything behind, or had it taken from them forcefully. It was the summer right after I graduated from high school. A good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the great outdoors was nothing beyond the couple of years we had in Cub Scouts of America when we were in elementary school. In other words, we had almost no idea what we were doing. We packed a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, supplies, etc., and headed off in his car. So I grew up in the 80s, so this is a time before the wide prevalence of cell phones and the existence of other portable digital devices. We drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours and then headed westward into the mountains in the area of Inyo Canyon. The first mistake, we didn't plan on which place to camp. We played it by ear, i.e. like fools. Second mistake, we left in mid-afternoon. It was pitch-black darkness when we arrived in the general area. We had driven off the main road and onto a dirt road in order to find a spot to camp. The dust from driving on the dirt road overwhelmed the headlight high beams when we finally decided to pull over and set up camp. It was around 23:30 around this time, and we were exhausted and famished. Any place was a good spot to camp for us, given our only reason to do so at that point was our hunger and exhaustion. Third mistake, we didn't bring flashlights. We only had Bic lighters for our cigarettes. We tried to set up the tent using our lighters and the headlights of the car, which were parked about 10 to 15 feet away. The wind was blowing, so the lighter constantly went out after a few seconds, either directly because of the wind or indirectly because the wind would push the flame onto our thumb. Clearly, we were complete idiots. We finished setting up the tent, but at that point, I was too tired to eat. My friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car, then crashed out in the tent. We woke to a very cold morning. It must have been around 5:30. Immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized that we were camped at the entrance of a hiking trail. There were at least 2 no camping signs in visible distance from us. We dismantled the tent, cleaned up, and cleared out. That morning, we ended up buying some cheap flashlights and a nice hot meal in a very small town. It wasn't really a town, but more like a few storefronts and shops on a main road, about the length of an average city block. We went into some office, though I don't recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station or the office headquarters for a campground. In any case, we found and reserved a site for the night. The campground was basically a large circle with campsites along its outer circumference, with each campsite being about 50 yards from its neighbor. In the middle of the circle was a common bathroom and shower. We circled around it once, and I think we saw one family that was all set up with a tent and camper. We found our spot and set up camp, which was quite far from them. That night was when we had a creepy encounter. My friend and I were laying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards and chatting. Our new flashlights eventually gave out. Yes, they were broken. Our fire pit was about 6 feet from the opening of our tent, and it was just a glowing ember. We probably should have completely put it out, and we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. In any case, there we were, chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot. After the 3rd or 4th time he got up to check his foot, I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something is tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of the tent, so from the outside you would have been able to see a bulge in the tent's side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the tent. There it is again. Each time it happened, there was a sound like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming that it was a twig or grass moving in the wind, or perhaps a loose strap on the outside of the tent. I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, but I do remember we suddenly became silent at the same time. A sound came to be audible to the both of us, footsteps slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or other non-human animal, but it seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured, like a step every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's coming." My friend didn't move. His face had an expression of fear. At some points, my friend bolted up and said, "Screw this." He grabbed his pipe, stuffed it full of pot, and took the biggest, deepest drag I'd ever seen a person take. About a minute or 2 later, he was out. Drugs aren't my thing, so I was alone in the tent as far as conscious bodies are concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and small blades as well as the ice pick in the middle and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers in the fire pit through the sheer nylon material of our tent, and I was able to roughly but barely discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently. The footsteps came closer and at the same slow pace. With each step, I could hear the dirt and rocks underfoot crunching and grinding. At some point it was clear to me that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fire pit, from my fuzzy line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent, became obscured by something outside the tent. The footsteps stopped right in front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches from the entrance to the tent. It was silent for about 1 minute, then I heard a click. At exactly the same time, I clearly saw through the nylon tent wall a flashlight turned on. I was able to see not just the flashlight, but the outline of the hand holding it. The flashlight was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches from the zipper. Blood drained out of my head, and my palms instantly became dripping in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was, the person immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there, inches from the tent's only entrance. My friend is out, totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretended that he was still awake and whispered just loud enough to be audible to our visitor. "Yes, loaded. There's one in the chamber." As if my friend was awake and asked me about our gun. And that was my fourth mistake. We didn't have a gun or any real weapon for self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dirt, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up the whole night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that I crashed out. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but found nothing missing. However, we did find boot prints leading away from our campsite and outside the campground. And that was the last time I camped in a tent. This story takes place in 2005. I was 12 years old at the time. My family wanted to take a vacation, and my mom and ex-stepdad decided it would be fun to take a cruise along the California coast with my 3 younger siblings and myself. As our ship made its way under the Golden Gate Bridge, my mom and I stood out on her balcony to see San Francisco and the ocean beyond us. On the balcony to the right of her, a teenage boy emerged, presumably to take in the same views we were. My mom gave him a polite hello, and they made awkward eye contact, and he struck up a conversation with her. I wasn't paying any attention at first, but when I heard him ask my mom, "Do you have any sisters?" I saw him peer over at me, clearly taking interest. Me, being a shy 12-year-old, tried to hide from his gaze behind my mother's side. My mom joked that she had 2 sisters, but they're probably much too old for him. They exchanged some polite small talk after that, which I didn't listen to, instead taking in the view of the sunset over San Francisco and the Pacific. We went about our separate ways for the evening. Over the next couple of days, we always seemed to be running into this boy and his family. My mother is an extremely friendly person, so she always would talk with them, and his parents seemed nice enough. The boy would always look at me intensely. By that point in my life, I was still developing my first crushes on boys in school. I sure didn't know what to do about that. I didn't even know what his fixation on me implied, just that it made me feel as if though he was seeing right through me. I avoided his stares by staying near my siblings, almost out of an instinctive protectiveness. On the 5th day of our trip, my mom came in and said this boy wanted to meet and hang out with us. She said his name was Asher. I thought he was weird and didn't really want to, but I was always taught to give people the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps my discomfort was me being judgmental, I thought. I reluctantly agreed, and eventually he was in our hotel room. My mom gave me the smile and raised her eyebrows as if she was playing matchmaker. Then she went into her room, which was connected to ours. Asher was very odd right off the bat, and immediately my siblings and I were extremely uncomfortable. We were watching Scary Godmother on Cartoon Network, and I awkwardly asked if he wanted to watch something else. He probably thought our cartoons were stupid. He said he didn't mind as long as he got to talk to me. My eldest brother, who was 10 at the time, immediately picked up on my body language and what he said, so he joined in on the conversation to put me at ease. Asher had an accent. I couldn't tell if he was foreign or if it was a speech impediment. A lot of what he said I couldn't quite pick up on, and he would sometimes lean over to me and say something quietly that, although I couldn't hear or understand, I knew I didn't like it. We spent the next while making awkward small talk about school, and he told me about his graduation coming up next summer. I asked if he was graduating junior high. No, he meant high school. He then revealed to me that he would be turning 18 that December. Sirens immediately started going off in my head, and then he hands me a note he said that he had written for me earlier. With my hand shaking, I opened the note that read, "I love you. You're hot." I guess my brother saw the note from over my shoulder and went over to my parents' room, then came back and said, "Hey, our parents said we had to go to dinner." Asher took this as his cue to leave, but told me he loves me one more time before his exit. I gave him a very shaky, okay. My brother went to make sure I was okay and told me he had only pretended to go to our parents' room because he didn't want to get our mom in trouble with her ex-stepdad for inviting him. I know this logic seems weird, but please remember we were all just kids. I was trembling and silent for a while. I didn't really understand what had happened. All I knew was that I felt violated and confused. We later told our mom what had happened, and she then looked extremely guilty. She thought he was younger and that he had good intentions. She thought it would be a good idea for me to meet friends closer to my age because I was stuck babysitting all the time. Turned out, for some dumb reason or another, my mother had given him our phone number before he had hung out with us. I was livid but too timid to speak up. I managed to avoid Asher for the rest of our trip aside from the loading docks on the final day. He said goodbye, that he loved me, and would call me every day before leaving. He left before I could tell him not to. He called almost every week for 4 months after that, leaving strange and cryptic messages on our answering machine. Every time we would block his number, he would manage to call from a new one. I accidentally picked up a couple of times not knowing it was him and would immediately hang up, only for him to call 3 more times and leave the same strange messages. After a year, he finally gave up and stopped calling. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about it to this day. I was on holiday in a city on the other side of the country celebrating my 21st birthday with my best friend. We were having an amazing night out with a few too many drinks and ended up meeting 2 guys, Andrew and Billy. They seemed like really cool guys, and we were into them, so when they asked us back to their hotel room, we said yes. Obviously a silly idea, but we were young and drunk. Things were great on the way back to the hotel room. We were all laughing and having a great time. When we got to the hotel room, there were 2 other men there as well, Ricky and JD, who were at least 10 to 15 years older than us. They gave us creepy vibes, but we brushed it off. We asked Andrew and Billy who these guys were, and they said that they were colleagues as they were in the city for work and the company paid for their rooms. So Andrew and Billy were in different rooms, but we were all partying in Andrew's room that he shared with Ricky. I got a little too drunk and my friend put me to bed. She said that she was going to Billy's room and asked if I would be okay with Andrew, and I said yes. Keep in mind, my friend didn't have a phone either, so we basically had no way of getting in contact with each other. Another stupid thing I know. So I'd been in the bed for a while with Andrew just talking and chilling when he says, "I just have to pop out, I'll be right back." I assumed he meant just out to the bathroom, not out of the actual hotel room, but he left the hotel room to get something from Billy's hotel room. Anyway, I was just watching TV in bed when the bedroom door opens and I assumed it was Andrew, but my heart sank when it was Ricky, the weird colleague. He walked into the room and sat on the bed. Keep in mind, I'm very naked at this point, trying to cover myself with a blanket. He said, "You do realize that everyone has left you alone in here, right? It's just you all alone. No one is here, and no one can hear you." And continued edging closer and closer to me on the bed. At this point, I was completely speechless and absolutely terrified. I was completely frozen in fear, and I had no idea what to do. I tried to say something, but nothing came out. He definitely sensed my fear, and for some reason, he just got up and left. A sense of relief flooded me, and I felt silly for overreacting. That was until I heard JD, the other random colleague, shouting, "Get the F back in here, what are you doing? This isn't what we discussed. Get back in there and do what you were meant to do. Who cares what that girl thinks? Just get back in there and do what you need to do." I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in because I was so scared, but there was no way out, and the only way out of the hotel room was through the front door, and I had to walk past Ricky and JD to get there. I was just so terrified. I had a million thoughts rushing through my head, and I had no idea what to do, but I knew that I had to escape. I decided my only option was just to leave the room and be ready to defend myself if things were to go pear-shaped. I threw my clothes on and grabbed my shoes. I opened the door, and Ricky and JD were sitting on a couch close to the bedroom door. JD said, "Hey, sexy, where are you going in such a rush? Come on and join us. Come here right now." I said no thanks and ran to the front door and ripped it open. When I got out, I was so relieved, but I was still in a random hotel in a random city with no way to contact my friend, but I thought my best option was to go to the lobby and just wait. As I was walking, I heard two men yelling down the hallway, "Where are you? We know you aren't too far away. Come back and join us. You know you want to." It was Ricky and JD. I was absolutely terrified by this point. I began sprinting to the elevator. I could hear them gaining on me. I never knew I could run so fast, but I just continued and didn't look back. I felt like I was running forever until I reached the end of the corridor and my worst nightmare had come true. I missed the turnoff of the elevator. So I had to turn and run back towards where I could hear Ricky and JD still yelling down the hall. I found the elevator and got in. I could hear their voices getting louder and louder, and I didn't want to imagine what would happen if they got into the elevator with me. The door finally closed after what felt like a lifetime. I thought I would go down to the lobby and just wait there because at least there would be people there, so there would be some form of safety. I got to the lobby and realized that there was no one in sight. No one at all, not even behind the desk. I sat there on the couch and didn't know what to do with myself. I was absolutely terrified that Ricky and JD would come to the lobby. Then I heard the elevator ding and the door open. My heart dropped, but it was Andrew. I told him what had happened, and he was outraged that his colleagues did that, and he took me to where my best friend was. Everything turned out to be fine, but it truly could have been a lot worse. When I was 25, there was a short time I was staying at my aunt's. It was her, my two cousins, and I. She lives in a nice apartment complex, and her unit is on the lower level. Her living room has a lot of windows that she keeps open for fresh air and for her cats to people watch. Her unit happens to be on the corner near a grassy courtyard path. When I first moved, I noticed a man who gave me an off vibe. My cousins and aunts said he lived upstairs and 2 units over, recovering from hard drugs that permanently messed him up. His parents paid for him to stay there as they didn't want him with them. They also said, other than hearing him mumble and say weird things, no one had ever had an issue. My aunt works nights and leaves at 3 a.m. My younger cousin works nights and leaves at 2 a.m. That usually left my same-aged cousin and I the only two there until we left for work at around 8. For context, it is a very open living room to dining room plan. My aunt always had people staying over, so she has a second couch in the dining room in place of a table. This was where I slept. She stayed on the one in the living room. My aunt has also never been one to lock her doors until this incident. One night I'm on my phone trying to sleep at about 1 a.m. and hear a man yelling. He's yelling, "Don't shoot," and banging on the door to the right of ours. 2 male college students live there and just told him he had the wrong apartment and to leave. He says sorry and walks off. I'm looking through the kitchen window, which is in direct line of sight from my couch bed, and it's the weird neighbor who sees me and grins. He then walks back to his home. I was unsettled, but not enough to wake anyone else up over it. Told my family nonchalantly the next day, and a Lol, that was weird sort of way. My cousin and I watched a movie and head off to bed. I have a very hard time staying asleep, but I woke up this time to the feeling of someone watching me. I check my phone and it's around 3:30 a.m., so I know it's not my aunt or cousin. I sit up and figure I'll go watch TV on my aunt's couch since she was gone already. The feeling gets stronger as I'm in the living room. Then I see the shadow of a person standing still in the grass courtyard looking in. I froze. I immediately go back to my couch to get my phone. As I do, the person is gone. I'm now trying to calm myself down and think of waking my cousin up when I hear the creepy man's voice. He is now at the kitchen window, which looks out directly in front of her front door. I drop to the floor out of his line of sight and start frantically trying to call my cousin. The man is now saying things at the window front door like, "I'm not gonna hurt you," and "I'm unarmed" over and over again. His face is up against the window. Then he starts talking about wanting to pet the cats he saw through the window. I can't get a hold of my cousin. It's been 20 minutes of this, at this point. In this complete, crazy situation, I didn't have many options. I could jump up and run for a knife, but I need to go to the kitchen. I could try to respond and ask him to leave, but I've learned when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. I now hear him knocking and knocking while repeating his nonsense. I'm doing that ridiculous-looking army crawl snake slither across the floor down the hall. I see the door handle start to turn. I'm about to jump up when my cousin bursts out of his room directly across from the front door. Now, he's not the biggest guy. Boy, was he intimidatingly mad at the circus show taking place at his front door. He starts yelling at the guy that needs to get the F off of his porch and that he's calling the cops. The man tries to say, "I'm unarmed. I'm not going to hurt you. Don't be afraid." My cousin goes off and yells that that's dandy. It's 4 a.m. You need to leave or I'll call the cops. What's wrong with you? So the guy backs up with his hands in the air and leaves. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. My aunt was called, who called the apartment manager. The next day when I come home from work, his parents were there packing moving boxes in a truck from his place. Maybe he was trying to get me to open the door by seeming friendly. Maybe he had a bad trip and really wanted to pet a cat to feel better. I suppose. We'll never know. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, big honkin' anime mommy milkers.